A king demanded a list of everything his new kingdom owned. The result was the Domesday Book, a census so final it was named for God's own day of judgment. But this is not just a ledger of taxes and land. It is a frozen moment, a snapshot of a conquered England, teeming with the lives of 30 key figures we are about to meet. We will become historical detectives, uncovering the barons and sheriffs, the bishops and survivors who shaped this incredible document. By the end, you will know the secret stories hidden within its pages for nearly 1,000 years. How did a powerful countess hold on to her lands after her husband's execution? Why does one entry simply list the word waste for an entire village? The answers are waiting. What kind of person do you think leaves the deepest mark on history? He was the storm that made the land fall silent. King William I, a man history would call the Conqueror, did not simply win a battle at Hastings and claim a crown. He seized an entire nation by the throat. To understand the Domesday Book, you must first understand the mind of the king who commanded it. This was not a project born from mere curiosity. It was an act of supreme control, a calculated move by a ruler who had spent nearly 20 years putting down rebellions and crushing dissent. His most brutal campaign, the harrying of the North, had left vast stretches of the country as waste, a scorched lesson to any who would defy him. But a wasteland pays no taxes. William needed to know what he actually owned, what lands could be squeezed for the silver required to pay his armies and build his castles. His motivation was a cold administrative genius. Imagine the sheer audacity of the idea, to send his officials into every shire, to demand that every local lord and elder swear an oath and answer a list of precise, probing questions. Who held this land in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many peasants work the fields? How many mills grind the grain? This was not a request. It was an inquisition. William was in effect compiling the ultimate legal title deed for his entire kingdom, a permanent record that would solidify his grip and silence any future disputes over who owned what. He is the first and most essential figure in our story because his will alone set the entire monumental process in motion. Without that singular, relentless command, the great census would never have been dreamed of, let alone completed with such terrifying efficiency. So as we look at the names and numbers within the Domesday Book, we are really seeing the world through the eyes of its architect, a king who sought to measure his new domain down to the last pig, and in doing so, froze his conquest in ink and parchment for 1,000 years. But the king's will alone could not build this empire of parchment. It required a second figure, a man who embodied the brutal pragmatism of the new regime. Meet Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent. If William was the architect of the Domesday Survey, then Odo was his chief enforcer, a living contradiction who wielded a bishop's crozier in one hand and a warrior's mace in the other. As William's half-brother, Odo was rewarded with a staggering portion of the conquered land. The Domesday Book records him as one of the greatest landholders in all of England, a man whose estate stretched across vast swaths of the country, generating immense wealth. His entries are a testament to raw power, listing hundreds of manors, thousands of peasants, and endless resources. Here was a clergyman who lived the life of a secular prince, leading knights into battle and amassing a fortune that rivaled the king's own. How does a man of God justify such worldly power and violence? For Odo, there seems to have been no conflict. He saw his role as consolidating the Norman victory by any means necessary, whether that meant praying for souls or crushing rebellions. He was the iron fist inside the velvet glove of the church, yet this very ambition, so clearly documented in the survey's dry list of his possessions, would ultimately be his undoing. Years after the Domesday Book was completed, Odo's hunger for power grew too great, and he fell out of favor with his royal brother, finding himself imprisoned for a time. This dramatic fall from grace adds a profound layer of meaning to his entries. When we read the long columns of land and wealth assigned to the Bishop of Bayeux, we are not just looking at an inventory. We are witnessing the rise of a man who had everything, a figure so central to the Norman project that his name is woven throughout the great book, yet whose own greed would eventually lead to his disgrace. His story is a stark reminder that the Domesday Book captured these powerful lives at a single moment in time, forever freezing them at the peak of their influence, unaware of the dramatic turns their futures would take. And while Odo amassed his fortune, another brother stood almost as tall in the shadow of the king, Robert of Mortain, William's other half-brother, became the cornerstone of Norman control in the restless southwest. The Domesday Book reveals him as the second greatest landholder in all of England, his name appearing beside vast estates across Cornwall and Devon. This was no accident of birthright. It was a deliberate act of statecraft. William placed his most trusted kin in regions where loyalty was the only true defense against rebellion. Robert's job was to hold the land, to implant the Norman presence so deeply that the local population could never again rise effectively. His entries in the Great Book read like a map of pacification, listing castle sites, strategic ports, and sprawling manors that funneled immense wealth directly into his coffers. But how did his power compare to his brother Odo's? The survey provides a cold, numerical answer. While Odo's holdings were slightly more extensive, Robert's were concentrated and strategically vital, making him fabulously wealthy and incredibly powerful in his own right. This was the family compact that secured the conquest. One brother, Odo, was the flamboyant operator, the politically ambitious bishop. The other, Robert, was the steady, martial presence, the anchor. Together they formed two pillars of the same regime, their combined power documented in the Domesday Book's relentless columns. Their stories, forever linked in its pages, show us that William did not conquer and rule alone. He built a fortress of family, and the Domesday Book is its ground plan, a permanent record of the bonds of blood and land that were meant to keep England subdued for 1,000 years. Yet another name echoes with the authority of a king, but this one guarded a frontier of fire. Roger de Montgomery, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was William's chosen sentinel for the most dangerous border in the realm. The Welsh marches were a wild and untamed land, a place of constant raids and simmering conflict, and William needed a man he could trust to be his personal bulwark. The Domesday Book reveals the staggering price of that trust. Roger's entry is a map of military power, listing over 350 manors across 12 counties, a territorial empire that gave him the wealth to field his own private army. He was more than just a landowner, he was a marcher lord, a title that came with near-royal authority to build castles, wage war, and administer justice without needing to ask the king's permission for every decision. This was feudalism in its rawest form. William could not be everywhere at once, so he planted men like Roger in the most volatile soil and gave them the tools to hold it. The castles Roger built, like the one at Montgomery that gave him his name, were not just stone fortresses. They were statements of permanent occupation, paid for by the vast incomes from his Domesday-listed lands. Can you picture the chain of command? The king commands the earl commands his knights, and the knights command the peasants who work the land that funds the entire structure. Roger de Montgomery's sprawling entry in the Domesday Book is the perfect blueprint for this new world order. It shows us the birth of a new aristocracy, loyal directly to the king and endowed with the resources to raise armies, all documented in relentless, bureaucratic detail. His story is one of delegated power, a king trusting a loyal subject with the keys to a kingdom, and the Domesday Book stands as the permanent, unarguable record of that monumental transaction. There's a pattern to the power laid out in the Domesday Book, a design as deliberate as the stitching on a tapestry. William de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, is that design in human form. He began as one of William the Conqueror's trusted companions at Hastings, and the Great Book shows his reward, a sprawling collection of estates scattered across 13 counties. From Norfolk to Sussex, from York to Surrey, his name appears again and again. But why would the king give a single barren land so far apart? This was not an accident or a simple reward. It was a masterstroke of political control. By preventing his barons from consolidating all their power in one geographic area, William ensured their loyalty. A lord with lands only in the north could potentially raise a rebel army from his own tenantry. A lord like de Warenne, whose manors were spread from one end of England to the other, could never rally all his resources against the crown. He was dependent on the king's peace to manage his own scattered empire. His wealth was immense, documented in the survey's lists of plows and peasants, but his political power was deliberately fractured. Yet de Warenne was more than just a collection of assets. The Domesday Book also hints at the legacy he wished to build beyond the battlefield. It records his foundation of Lewes Priory, a great monastic house. This was a common act for Norman barons, a way to atone for the violence of their conquest and secure a place in the afterlife. The lands he granted to the priory, also carefully noted in the survey, became a permanent part of England's spiritual and physical landscape. So when we trace the name William de Warenne through the Domesday folios, we see the complete picture of a Norman aristocrat. He was a warrior rewarded with scattered wealth, a politician kept in check by design, and a man who used that wealth to build a legacy meant to last for eternity. While the king's brothers and earls secured the borders, another kind of power was being built at the very heart of the realm. Geoffrey de Manville was not just a landholder, he was the master key to London and the fertile counties that surrounded it. His entries in the Domesday Book are a map of strategic influence, listing manors and rights throughout Essex, Middlesex, and Hertfordshire. This was the prosperous, densely populated region that supplied the capital, and controlling it was essential for controlling England itself. Geoffrey's role as a royal constable gave him military authority in and around the city, a position of immense trust from the king. Why would William place so much power in the hands of one man so close to the seat of power? The answer lies in the very design of Norman rule. Geoffrey was the king's man on the ground, the official responsible for security in the most vital region, his loyalty ensured by the vast wealth the Domesday Book so carefully records. Every plow team, every peasant, every mill on his lands represented not just income, but the capacity to raise troops and enforce the king's peace at a moment's notice. This was the foundation upon which dynasties were built. The lands and titles granted to Geoffrey de Manville would become the inheritance of his descendants, a source of power that would, within a few generations, make the Manville name synonymous with political ambition and ruthless opportunism. The dry entries in the Great Survey, listing his holdings manor by manor, are the quiet prologue to a much louder and more violent drama. They set the stage for a time of civil war when a later Manville would use this very inheritance to become one of the most powerful and feared men in a kingdom tearing itself apart. So as we read his Domesday entry, we are not just looking at a list of properties, we are witnessing the planting of a seed, a concentration of power in the home counties that would one day bear bitter fruit. A new name now rises from the pages, one that would echo through the halls of power for centuries. Richard Fitz-Gilbert, the founder of the de Clare dynasty, received a king's ransom in land for his loyalty. The Domesday Book meticulously records his reward, a vast patchwork of estates with a particularly strong concentration in two key regions, Suffolk and Kent. These were not just random parcels of earth. Suffolk, with its fertile fields and busy ports, was an economic powerhouse. Kent, the gateway to the continent, was of immense strategic importance. Controlling these areas meant controlling both wealth and the primary route to Normandy. Richard's entries list dozens of manors, hundreds of peasants, and immense resources, painting a portrait of a baron planted firmly in the soil of England's most valuable real estate. But this was more than a personal reward. It was the seed of a dynasty. The Domesday Book captures the very moment this family's engine of power was first ignited. From this solid foundation in Suffolk and Kent, the de Clares would build a legacy of influence that stretched across 2 centuries. They would become earls, lead armies, and shape the fate of nations, their name forever linked to the Conquest documented in this great survey. Every plow and every peasant listed under Richard Fitz-Gilbert's name was a brick in the foundation of a house that would one day help rule England and conquer Ireland. His entry is a birth certificate for one of the medieval world's most formidable families. While the de Clares secured the prosperous South, another man was given a kingdom of his own in the wild North. Hugh d'Avranches, the Earl of Chester, was a lord like no other in England. His domain was a frontier, a sprawling territory of marshes and mountains where the king's law was a distant whisper. The Domesday Book records his power with a unique status, treating Chester almost as a separate principality. Hugh held the rights of a king here. He could raise his own armies, mint his own coins, and hold his own courts, answering to no one but William himself. This was the power of a marcher lord, amplified to its absolute limit, and he earned his savage nickname, Hugh the Wolf, through relentless campaigns against the Welsh. His rule was not one of administration, but of constant, brutal warfare. His ferocity was legendary, a necessary trait for a man tasked with taming a hostile border. The lands listed under his name in the Great Survey were not just sources of wealth, they were military outposts, the economic engine for a permanent war machine. Can you picture the contrast? In the settled shires of the South, The Domesday Book records plows and peasants. In Hugh's earldom, it documents the resources for a conqueror. His story shows us that Norman England was not a single uniform state. It was a patchwork of different rules, and Hugh the Wolf ruled the most independent patch of all, a frontier king whose authority was carved out with a sword and solemnly recorded in the King's Great Book. His name was Waltheof, and his story is written in the ink of the Domesday Book as a ghost story. He stands out as a rare and fading figure, the last major Anglo-Saxon earl in a world now dominated by Norman lords. The Great Survey records his vast holdings across the Midlands and the North, lands he inherited from a lineage of English nobility that stretched back centuries. To see his name there, surrounded by the new French aristocracy, is to witness the end of an era, but Waltheof's life was a web of tragic contradictions. He had initially submitted to William, even marrying the king's niece Judith. For a time it seemed he might successfully navigate the new order, a respected English lord integrated into the Norman court. Yet he could never fully escape the pull of his own people and the simmering resentment against foreign rule. This tension tore him apart. He was drawn into the revolt of the Earls in 1075, a plot by powerful Norman and English figures to overthrow William. The conspiracy failed, and the king's retribution was swift and absolute. While other conspirators fled, Waltheof alone faced the ultimate price. He was captured and, after a year of imprisonment, publicly executed. He remains the only English earl of his rank to be executed by a Norman king, a stark symbol of the old world's final, brutal suppression, and what happened to the land so carefully listed under his name. The Domesday Book itself provides the chilling answer. His vast estates from Northamptonshire to Huntingdonshire were systematically stripped from his family and redistributed to loyal Normans. His widow Judith was even granted some of his former properties, a cruel twist that cemented the transfer of power. When you trace the path of Waltheof's lands from his entry to the entries of his Norman successors, you are watching the Domesday Book perform its most fundamental duty. It is not just a snapshot of who held the land in 1086, it is the legal document that made the Norman dispossession of the English aristocracy permanent, and Waltheof's tragic fate is the human heart of that cold, administrative process. Alan the Red held a kingdom of scars. This Breton lord, a loyal follower of William, was granted the vast honor of Richmond in Yorkshire, and his entry in the Domesday Book is a chilling archaeological report. It does not just list his manners and men, it records a catastrophe. Page after page for his lands carries the single devastating Latin word, vasta, waste. This is the direct bureaucratic evidence of the harrying of the North, William's brutal campaign of scorched earth punishment. The king's armies had swept through the region years before, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and destroying villages to crush all resistance. The Domesday Survey, compiled nearly 2 decades later, shows the land had still not recovered. Where there should be lists of plows and peasants, there is only that haunting term, waste, for settlement after settlement. Alan the Red was not just a landowner, he was a warden of a wounded land, tasked with rebuilding an economy from ashes. His immense wealth, drawn from his other estates, was likely poured into this effort, a long and painful process of resettling peasants and restarting the plows on land that had fallen silent. Yet this hardened Breton lord also has a tantalizing, almost romantic connection to one of England's most enduring legends. He is widely believed to be the second husband of Lady Godiva, the Anglo-Saxon noblewoman famed for her legendary ride through Coventry. While her story is wrapped in myth, their potential union is a powerful symbol, a bridge between the brutal new reality of the Norman conquest and the romanticized memory of the old English order. So when you read the entry for Alan the Red, you are seeing two histories collide, the stark record of a wasted landscape and the ghost of a story about a lady who defied a king. Eustace II carried a grudge as heavy as his sword. The Count of Boulogne was no Norman, but a powerful French ally whose presence at the Battle of Hastings was a crucial part of William's coalition. The Domesday Book confirms his reward, listing manors for him in 11 different counties, a significant stake in the conquered kingdom, yet his relationship with the conqueror was a turbulent dance of loyalty and betrayal. He fought bravely for William at Hastings, a fact celebrated in the famous Bayeux tapestry, which even depicts him pointing towards the fleeing English troops. But just a few years later, that alliance shattered. He led a failed rebellion against William, besieging a castle at Dover only to be bloodily repulsed. This was not a man who accepted second place gracefully, so why does his name and his lands appear so prominently in the great survey taken years after his treason? The answer is a testament to the messy, pragmatic realities of power. At some point, Eustace and William reconciled. The king needed a powerful counterweight to his own increasingly ambitious Norman barons, and Eustace needed the wealth and status that English lands provided. His continued presence in the Domesday Book proves that the new ruling class was not a monolithic Norman bloc. It was a patchwork of French, Breton, and Flemish interests, all bound together by ties of land and silver, their past conflicts carefully set aside for the sake of present stability. The record of his estates is more than a list of properties. It is a document of political forgiveness, a frozen moment in a long and complicated relationship between two proud men who found it more profitable to be allies than enemies. Sweyn of Essex carries a name that echoes an older England. In a world now filled with names like William and Robert, his Anglo-Scandinavian identity stands out in the Domesday Book like a relic from a fading past. Here was a lord who had held power before the Normans came, and unlike so many of his peers, he did not end up exiled, executed, or stripped of everything. The Great Survey records him still holding a significant portion of his ancestral lands in Essex, a remarkable feat of survival. How did he manage it when the tide of history was so clearly against him? The answer lies not in sentiment, but in William the Conqueror's cold pragmatism. Sweyn was not a direct threat. He was a local power broker, a man who understood the land and its people. For William, it was often more efficient to co-opt such a figure than to crush him entirely. Leaving a known and seemingly cooperative English lord in place, especially one with Scandinavian roots in a region with its own distinct identity, could help ensure stability and the steady flow of taxes. Sweyn's continued presence in Essex acted as a bridge, a signal to the local population that some elements of their old world could persist under the new order, so long as they accepted the ultimate authority of the king. His entry in the Domesday Book is therefore more than a list of manners. It is a testament to a political calculation, a deliberate choice by a conqueror who understood that total eradication was not always the most effective form of control. Sweyn's survival hints at the quiet negotiations and unspoken agreements that must have taken place in the shadow of the Norman castles, a story of adaptation and reluctant acceptance written between the lines of the Great Inquisition. The Church was the silent partner in the Norman conquest, a spiritual and financial power whose cooperation William could not afford to lose, and at its head stood one of the most learned men in Europe, Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury. His entry in the Domesday Book is unlike any other, for it does not list the personal property of a single man. Instead, it meticulously catalogues the vast and ancient holdings of the See of Canterbury itself. The survey reveals the archbishopric as a colossal landowner, with manors and estates stretching across Kent and beyond, generating immense wealth from thousands of peasants, scores of mills, and endless plow teams. This was not Lanfranc's private fortune. It was the permanent endowment of the most important religious office in England, a source of power that made him a political force to be reckoned with. But Lanfranc was far more than a wealthy prelate. He was William's closest advisor and a trusted friend, a fellow Norman who shared the king's vision of a centralized, orderly kingdom. Their relationship was the cornerstone of church-state cooperation. William needed a reliable archbishop to legitimize his rule in the eyes of God and to control the powerful English clergy, and Lanfranc needed the king's military backing to impose his sweeping reforms. Together they transformed the English church, replacing Anglo-Saxon bishops with Normans, enforcing clerical celibacy, and bringing English religious practices in line with those of the continent. Can you see the dual nature of his power? The Domesday Book shows us the economic foundation, the lands that funded his authority, but his true influence lay in his intellect and his unwavering alliance with the king. He was the administrative genius who often governed England when William was in Normandy, a man who used his vast resources not for personal glory, but to build a church that was both spiritually rigorous and unshakably loyal to the crown. When you read the sprawling entry for the Archbishop of Canterbury, you are looking at the blueprint for this partnership, a record of the earthly wealth that supported a divine mission, all overseen by a man who helped weave the church into the very fabric of the new Norman state. Remigius de Fécamp was building a monument to God and King on a windswept hill. As the new Norman Bishop of Lincoln, he undertook one of the most ambitious physical projects of the entire conquest, moving his episcopal seat from the sleepy village of Dorchester to the commanding heights of Lincoln. This was not a simple change of address, it was a strategic masterstroke, a declaration of power written in stone. The old Anglo-Saxon church at Dorchester was a relic of a past era. Lincoln, by contrast, was a bustling town dominated by a formidable new Norman castle. By placing his cathedral directly opposite the king's fortress, Remigius was forging an unbreakable link between spiritual and secular authority. The Domesday Book provides the financial blueprint for this colossal undertaking. Its entries for the bishopric of Lincoln reveal a sprawling portfolio of land and wealth, with manors and resources stretching across the county. This was the economic engine that would fund the decades-long construction of one of England's great cathedrals. Can you picture the sheer scale of such an endeavor? The survey's dry lists of plow teams, peasants, and mills were not just assets on a ledger. They were the source of the stone, the wages for the masons, and the food for the laborers who would raise this breathtaking structure towards the heavens. Remigius did not live to see his cathedral completed, but his vision, bankrolled by the vast holdings recorded in the Domesday Book, set its foundation. His story shows us that the Norman Church was not merely a passive institution. It was an active building force, a partner in the conquest that physically reshaped the English landscape, replacing the old with the new in the most visible and enduring way possible. Geoffrey, Bishop of Coutances, embodied a world where the cross and the sword were wielded by the same hand. He was a Norman bishop who answered to the Pope, yet the Domesday Book reveals him as one of the great secular barons of England, holding vast estates across 8 counties. His power was not confined to the altar. He served William the Conqueror as a royal judge, a trusted figure who dispensed the king's law with the same authority with which he might preach a sermon. This dual role reached its peak during the Domesday Inquest itself. Geoffrey was appointed to preside over one of the circuit courts in the West Country, where panels of local jurors were compelled to swear oaths and answer the king's intrusive list of questions. Picture the scene in a crowded hall. Here was a bishop, a man of God, demanding to know the value of every pig and every acre, settling disputes over land ownership with the finality of a royal decree. He was not just a subject of the Great Survey, he was one of its chief architects and enforcers in the region. His presence in that role completely blurred the line between ecclesiastical and secular authority. The church was not a separate sphere operating in the background. It was an integral, muscular arm of the state, its high-ranking clergy personally invested in the success of the Norman project because their own immense wealth and power were tied directly to it. When the Domesday Book records the lands of the Bishop of Coutances, it is documenting the earthly reward for this service. His story shows us that to understand Norman England, you cannot separate the castle from the cathedral. There were 2 pillars of the same fortress, and men like Geoffrey were the mortar that held them together, but the king's law was only as just as the man who enforced it. In the shires, far from the eyes of the court, a different kind of power operated with brutal efficiency. Sheriff Peacock of Cambridgeshire stands as one of the most infamous figures in the entire Domesday Book, a local official whose name became synonymous with tyranny. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by those who suffered under his rule, did not mince words. It described him as a ravening wolf, a predator who devoured the possessions of his neighbors. This was not merely poetic anger, it was a precise accusation. The Domesday Book itself becomes a legal record of his crimes, filled with the muffled complaints of the dispossessed. Entry after entry notes land that once belonged to a local abbey or a minor English thegn, now strangely and firmly in the possession of the sheriff. His method was simple and devastating. He would use his judicial authority to levy false charges or impose impossible fines, forcing landowners to surrender their property to settle their alleged debts. He was the tax collector, the judge, and the beneficiary, all rolled into one corrupt office. Imagine a man who could legally declare your farm his own simply because he said you owed the king money, with no real court to appeal to. The dry Latin of the survey occasionally lets this injustice slip through, recording that so and so holds this land, but the men of the hundreds say it belongs to the church. These are the ghosts of grievances, the formal protests that were entered into the permanent record. perhaps with the faint hope that the king himself would one day see them and provide justice. Pico's story reveals the dark underbelly of the Norman system. For every great baron building a cathedral, there was a sheriff like him in the countryside, using the new order as a weapon for personal enrichment, proving that the conquest was not just won on the battlefield, but cemented through the calculated cruelty of local administration. Sheriff Hugh Fitz-Baldric faced a landscape of ghosts, while Picot of Cambridgeshire preyed upon the prosperous south. Hugh's jurisdiction was the north, a realm still gasping for breath after the king's harrowing. His entries in the Domesday Book for Yorkshire are not simple lists of wealth. They are medical charts for a patient that had nearly bled out. His monumental task was to reassess a wasteland, to put a number on land that had been systematically burned and left barren years before. How do you calculate the tax value of a village that is no longer there? How do you count the plow teams when the oxen are all dead and the farmers are gone? Hugh's work provides the chilling answers. He recorded value where he could find it, but the word waste appears with haunting frequency, a stark admission that some places had simply ceased to function. His role went far beyond simple accounting. He was the chief agent of the crown's attempt to force life back into the scarred earth, tasked with resettling peasants, encouraging new lords to take on the devastated manors, and slowly, painfully, restarting the economic engine of the north. The pressure on him would have been immense. The king demanded revenue, but the land had none to give. Every entry Hugh oversaw was a balancing act between the conqueror's insatiable need for silver and the brutal reality of a broken country. His documentation is a grim ledger of pacification, proving that the conquest did not end with a single battle. It continued for decades in the painstaking work of men like Hugh, who wielded a parchment scroll as effectively as a sword, trying to rebuild what the king's armies had once destroyed. Azur's name appears like a whisper from a world that had almost vanished. He is listed in the Domesday Book as a king's thegn, an English nobleman who had somehow held onto a precious sliver of his land, held directly from William the Conqueror himself. In a document dominated by Norman names, his entry is a small but profound anomaly. It forces us to ask, how did this one man survive the wholesale transfer of an entire kingdom? The answer lies in the messy, uneven reality of the conquest. The dispossession of the English elite was not a single, overnight event. It was a rolling wave that crashed over the country at different speeds and with varying force. The great magnates, the earls like Waltheof, were swept away immediately, but further down the social ladder, among the local thanes who administered the king's own estates, there were pockets of survival. Azur was likely one of these men, a local official whose knowledge and administrative skills were simply too valuable for the new regime to discard. He knew the boundaries of the fields, the customs of the 100 Court, and the names of the people who worked the land. For a king trying to maximize his revenue from every shire, that kind of practical intelligence was worth more than blind loyalty to a new aristocracy. So Azur was kept on, a relic of the old order now serving the new, his continued tenure a quiet testament to administrative necessity. His small holding, carefully recorded in the Great Survey, is a window into the countless unrecorded negotiations that must have taken place across England. It shows us that the conquest was not just a story of total replacement, but also one of grudging integration, where a handful of Englishmen found a narrow path to survival by making themselves useful to their new masters. The true wealth of a conquered kingdom was not measured only in fields of wheat, but in the silver that crossed its market stalls. While barons carved up the countryside, a different kind of power was rising within the walled towns, and the Domesday Book took careful note. In the bustling city of Lincoln, a man named Calsween stands out from the pages, not as a Norman knight or a dispossessed English earl, but as a wealthy Anglo-Danish burgess. His name itself tells a story of a hybrid identity, a blend of the old Danish settlers and the native English, thriving in the urban landscape. The survey records him holding a substantial amount of property right in the heart of the city, a clear sign of his commercial success. This was not agricultural land, but urban real estate, the shops and houses that formed the engine of trade. His presence is a crucial reminder that the Domesday inquest was not solely focused on manors and peasants. It was also a census of urban wealth, a recognition that the king's revenue depended as much on the taxes from merchants and craftsmen as it did on the harvest from the fields. Calsween represents the emerging merchant class, the men whose networks of trade connected England to the wider world, bringing in luxury goods and exporting wool and other commodities. They were the financiers of the realm, often lending money to the very barons who supposedly ruled them. Can you see the two Englands taking shape? One was rural, feudal, and defined by military service, documented in the vast rural holdings of the Norman elite. The other was urban, commercial, and increasingly defined by coin, captured in the brief but telling entries for men like Colsween of Lincoln. His story proves that even amidst a military conquest, economic life had its own relentless momentum, and a savvy merchant could build a fortune that the new Norman lords could not afford to ignore. Thorkel of Arden held his lands by a thread of ancient knowledge. In the former Danelaw, that region of England where Danish law and custom still held powerful sway, his name in the Domesday Book signals a different kind of survival. He was not a king's thin like Azor, but a prominent local lord from a family deeply rooted in the soil of Warwickshire. The Great Survey reveals a fascinating arrangement. Thorkel is recorded as holding his ancestral manors not directly from the king, but as a tenant of the powerful Norman Baron Henry de Furs. This is the key to his story, a perfect example of the quiet accommodations that allowed the conqueror's regime to function. Why would a Norman lord like de Furs, himself a major Domesday figure, keep an Englishman in place beneath him? The answer lies in the unique challenges of governing the Danelaw. This was a place with its own complex legal traditions, its own social hierarchies, and a population with mixed Anglo-Scandinavian loyalties. A Norman outsider, no matter how powerful, would struggle to understand the local customs, the boundaries of fields, or the webs of obligation that made the land productive. Thorkel possessed that vital, localized intelligence. He was the key that unlocked the wealth of his region for his new overlord. His continued tenure was a business decision, a pragmatic choice by de Furs to ensure the smooth running of his estates and the steady flow of their revenue. So Thorkel of Arden became a bridge, a figure who translated the old world for the new, managing his manors under the authority of a foreign lord. His survival, so carefully documented, shows us that the Norman settlement was not a simple two-layer cake of conquerors and conquered. It was a complex pyramid, with surviving English elites like Thorkel forming a crucial middle stratum, their loyalty purchased by the right to remain on the land their families had held for generations. They were the administrative glue that held the fractured kingdom together. Her name drifts through the Domesday Book like a half-remembered song, a figure of immense wealth wrapped in the gauze of legend. Edith the Fair, often identified as the Lady Godiva of folklore, stands apart from every other figure we have met. She was a woman who held vast lands in her own right, a powerful widow whose name appears repeatedly across the Midlands, from Buckinghamshire to Staffordshire. In an age where women were legally subsumed by their husbands, her independence was a remarkable anomaly. The Great Survey meticulously records her holdings, listing manor after manor, plough teams, and peasants that answered directly to her. She was not merely surviving the conquest, she was thriving within its new order. Her wealth so significant it demanded the king's scribes pay her careful attention. This is the historical Edith, a landowner of formidable means. Then there is the myth, the tale of the noblewoman who rode naked through the streets of Coventry to protest her husband's oppressive taxes. That story, written down centuries later, is a beautiful fiction, a folk memory that likely grew from a kernel of truth about a real character, her piety, and her defiance. The Domesday Book provides no details of any ride, but it offers something far more valuable, the cold, hard proof of her power. It shows us a woman who commanded resources that rivaled some of the king's own barons. How did she achieve this? Her first husband was a powerful English earl, and as his widow, she retained control of her dower lands, the portion granted to her for her lifetime. This was her legal right, and even William the Conqueror, for all his ruthlessness, often respected such established customs when it served his purpose. A wealthy, cooperative English noblewoman was less troubled than a dispossessed and vengeful one, so the legend of Godiva may be a fable, but the woman who inspired it was very real. Her entry in the survey is the anchor that tethers the flight of story to the ground of history, proving that sometimes the truth of a person's influence is just as compelling as the myth that grows around them. Judith carried the blood of the conqueror and the lands of the conquered. As the niece of William the Conqueror, her marriage to the English Earl Waltheof was meant to be a symbol of reconciliation, a union of Norman and Saxon lines that would bind the new kingdom together. But when Waltheof was executed for treason, Judith's life took a dramatic and unexpected turn. The Domesday Book reveals the stunning outcome of that personal tragedy. She did not fade into obscurity or retreat to a nunnery. Instead, she emerged as one of the richest and most powerful landowners in all of England, holding vast estates across the Midlands in her own name. How did a woman in this era achieve such a position? She was the ultimate survivor, navigating the deadly currents of court politics with a sharp intelligence. Her husband's execution, while a personal catastrophe, became her financial opportunity. As his widow, she was legally entitled to her dower share, a third of his immense holdings. But she secured far more than that. King William, her uncle, granted her the bulk of Waltheof's confiscated lands to hold directly from the crown. This was not an act of family kindness. It was a calculated political move. By placing these strategically vital lands in the hands of a woman who was both his kin and unquestionably loyal, William ensured they would not fall into the hands of an ambitious and potentially rebellious baron. Judith became a custodian of royal power, her name in the survey standing as a bulwark against the ambitions of other Norman lords. Her story shatters our simple notions of this period. She was not a passive victim of her husband's fate. She was an active player who leveraged her royal connections and legal rights to build a power base that was entirely her own, a testament to female agency in a world designed to suppress it. Her entry in the Domesday Book is more than a list of properties. It is the record of a political masterstroke, one that ensured the king's control while securing a widow's extraordinary independence. Ejifu the Fair held a world in her hands before it was taken away. Her name, meaning precious gift, appears in the Domesday Book not as a current owner, but as a ghost, a former holder from the time of the good King Edward. The survey records her once vast estates, land she owned outright across several counties, a testament to the wealth and status an English noblewoman could command before the Normans came. She was a figure of substance and independence, her life anchored in the manors and farms that bore her name. Yet when the scribes wrote their entries for the year 1086, they noted a stark and simple transformation. Her lands, particularly a valuable cluster in Yorkshire, were now held by Count Alan the Red, the same Breton lord we met presiding over the wasted north. This transfer is not presented as a dispute or a question. It is recorded as a simple, unchangeable fact. Ejif's story is not one of dramatic rebellion or tragic execution like Waltheof's, and it lacks the legendary fame of Edith the Fair. That is what makes it so powerful and so common. Her dispossession was quiet, administrative, and total. She represents the thousands of unnamed English thegns and landowners, the prosperous local gentry who were the bedrock of the old society, silently erased from the record of current holders. The Domesday Book, in its relentless efficiency, became the legal instrument of that erasure. Why does this matter? Because for every great earl who fell, there were 100 Ejifs, men and women whose world vanished not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. Her entry is a memorial to a vanquished class, a poignant reminder that the Norman conquest was not just a change of rulers at the top, but a seismic upheaval that reached down into the very soil, reassigning the roots of power from one people to another. Yet sometimes that resistance was not silent, but roared from the misty fens of East Anglia. The Domesday Book entry for the Abbey of Ely tells a story of sanctity and rebellion, its vast estates marked by the scars of a last, desperate stand. The abbey itself was one of the wealthiest religious houses in England, its land sprawling across the watery landscape, a kingdom within a kingdom. But when the scribes compiled their great survey, they recorded more than just its wealth. They noted devastation. Manors that should have been thriving were listed as waste, their value slashed, a direct and bureaucratic admission of recent violence. This is the ghost of Hereward the Wake haunting the pages of the Domesday Book. His rebellion, based from the abbey's own impregnable marshes, was one of the final and most tenacious challenges to Norman rule. For years, he and his band of followers used the watery terrain as their fortress, launching guerrilla attacks against the king's forces and holding out long after the rest of England had been subdued. William's response was characteristically brutal. He laid siege to the Isle of Ely, building a causeway across the marshes and finally crushing the resistance. The abbey itself was punished for harboring the rebels. Its lands were ravaged, its treasures plundered, and its abbot was replaced with a loyal Norman. So when you read the Ely entry, you are seeing the king's retribution written in the language of accounting. The reduced values and the notes of waste are not just economic data. They are the official record of a monastery's punishment, the price it paid for defiance. The legend of Hereward the Wake is a tale of heroic resistance, but the Domesday Book provides the cold, factual counterpoint, showing us the tangible cost of that heroism, measured in burned manors and emptied coffers. It proves that even the holiest of places were not immune to the conqueror's wrath. The abbot of Bury St. Edmunds ruled a kingdom of relics. His entry in the Domesday Book is not merely a list of pious donations. It is the charter for a private state, a sprawling territory in Suffolk where the abbey's authority surpassed even the king's own sheriffs. This was the liberty of St. Edmund, a sacred precinct where the abbot held the power of life and death. He could hold his own courts, collect his own taxes, and raise his own armies, answering to no one but God and the distant figure of the king. The sheer scale of this spiritual fiefdom is breathtaking. The survey records the abbey holding 8,500, an ancient administrative unit that gave the abbot control over dozens of villages and thousands of peasants. Imagine a land where the law was not proclaimed in the king's name, but in the name of a martyred Anglo-Saxon king, St. Edmund himself. His shrine was the heart of this domain, a destination for pilgrims whose offerings fueled the abbey's immense wealth that the Domesday scribes meticulously catalogued. This was the dual nature of power in Norman England. While barons like Hugh the Wolf secured the physical borders, abbots like the one at Bury St. Edmunds secured the spiritual ones, their influence woven into the very fabric of society. They were political players of the highest order, their loyalty to the crown guaranteed by the immense privileges and lands they controlled. The Domesday Book, in its dry inventory of the abbey's manors, mills, and men, is really mapping the contours of this sacred sovereignty, proving that some walls were built not of stone, but of faith and ancient tradition. A city's pulse can be measured by the number of its burgesses. In the entries for York, the Domesday Book does exactly that, shifting our gaze from the rural manors of barons to the crowded, contested streets of one of England's great northern cities. Here, the key figures are not singular lords but a collective, the burgesses, the property-owning citizens who formed the economic heart of urban life. The survey records their numbers with chilling precision, noting that while there were plots for over 1,400 burgesses before the Conquest, a devastating portion of them were now waste or could not pay the tax. This is the urban echo of the harrying of the North, a catastrophe written not in scorched fields but in abandoned workshops and empty houses. York was not just a city in decline, it was a city gasping for survival, its value slashed, its capacity to generate wealth for the crown crippled. This urban perspective is a crucial, often overlooked layer of the Domesday record. It reminds us that the Norman conquest was not solely a struggle for land, but a battle for control over the networks of trade and manufacture that powered the kingdom. The king's officials were counting more than peasants and plows. They were assessing the health of a commercial ecosystem. The fate of the burgesses of York, their collective struggle to rebuild amidst the ruins, tells a story of resilience that is just as compelling as the saga of any single earl or bishop, proving that a city's recovery is the true measure of a kingdom's lasting peace. Their freedom was measured in acres and owed not to a lord's whim, but to ancient custom. In the vast flat fenlands of Lincolnshire and East Anglia, the Domesday Book records a class of peasant unlike any other, the sokemen. They were not the tied villeins who made up the bulk of England's population, bound to their lord's land and subject to his will. The sokemen were free in a way that was already becoming rare. They owned their own plows, they could sell their own land, and they could seek a new lord if they were dissatisfied. Their obligations were fixed, often a simple rent or specific duties, not the uncertain and heavy labor services demanded of a villein. Why does this matter? Because their prominence in the Domesday entries for this region is a direct echo of the past. This was the heart of the old Danelaw, a territory shaped by Scandinavian settlers who had brought with them traditions of a freer peasantry. The Norman scribes, with their relentless focus on categorization, did not erase this distinction. They preserved it, meticulously counting the sokemen village by village, their entries forming a detailed map of a different social world. This was not just a census of wealth, it was a snapshot of a way of life. For the conquering Normans, understanding this local peculiarity was essential to tapping its wealth. A free peasant with his own resources could generate more reliable revenue than a broken serf, so the Great Book, often an instrument of oppression, also became an accidental archive of liberty, freezing in time the last vestiges of a freer England that would slowly fade away in the centuries to come. But the king's needs extended far beyond the loyalty of his barons and the taxes of his peasants. Scattered throughout the Domesday Book are the small, peculiar holdings of men known as the king's serjeants. These were not great lords, but minor officials and skilled craftsmen who held their land directly from William in return for very specific, personal services. Their entries form a fascinating mosaic of the royal household's daily life. One serjeant might hold a few acres for the duty of providing a dozen horses when the king traveled through his shire. Another was responsible for supplying a certain number of arrows or for maintaining a section of the royal hunting grounds. We find men bound to provide hunting dogs, to act as messengers, or to use their craft, like that of a farrier or a bowyer, exclusively for the crown's benefit. These were not payments in silver or military service, but in the practical, tangible goods and skills that kept the royal machine functioning. Imagine the intricate web of obligation this created, stretching from the king's own court to tiny villages across England. A man in Berkshire was not just a farmer, he was the king's designated supplier of hawks for falconry. His land was his salary, and his specialized labor was the tax he paid. These certainty tenures reveal a kingdom managed with a personal, almost domestic attention to detail. They show us that the Domesday Survey was not only about mapping grand estates, but also about cataloging the countless small cogs that made the royal wheel turn, proving that the power of a king could be measured in horses, hounds, and expertly fletched arrows. Their names are not written in the Great Book, but their labor built the kingdom. Beneath the named barons and bishops, the true foundation of the Domesday record rests on the shoulders of the unfree peasants, the villeins and bordars who form the vast, anonymous majority of England's population. The survey meticulously counts them, not as individuals but as economic units, their lives reduced to numbers in a column. A typical entry might list 20 villeins, 8 bordars, and a handful of slaves, all bound to the land they worked. But what did these terms actually mean for the people living them? A villein was a tenant farmer, typically holding around 30 acres for himself and his family. In return, he owed his lord several days of labor each week, working the lord's own Domesday fields, along with extra duties at harvest time and a portion of his own crop as rent. His life was one of relentless toil, his freedom severely limited, unable to leave the manor or sell his own animal without the lord's permission. The bordar was even worse off, holding a smaller cottage with just a few acres, perhaps only 5, forcing him to spend most of his time laboring on the lord's land simply to survive. Their collective existence was the engine of the entire feudal system. Every loaf of bread eaten in a baron's hall, every bushel of grain sold to pay for a knight's armor, every taxed silver coin sent to the king, was ultimately produced by their hands. The Domesday Book's staggering totals, its records of wealth and value, are simply the harvested fruit of their endless labor. When we read that a manor was worth £20 a year, we are really reading the measured output of the villeins' plows and the bordars' scythes. They are the human bedrock of every entry, the silent, unnamed partners in every transaction, their lives the true, unwritten story on every page of William's great inquest. They move through the shires like ghosts, their authority absolute and their purpose singular. The Domesday Commissioners were the nameless engines of the entire survey, the royal officials dispatched on a circuit of England to extract the truth of the kingdom, 100 by 100. We do not know their individual names, but their methodical work is preserved in the very structure of the Great Book itself. Their process was a masterpiece of early bureaucracy. They traveled in small panels, likely a mix of great barons, bishops, and royal clerks, and they convened local courts in each shire. There they would summon a cross-section of the community, the sheriff, the barons, the priests, and most importantly, a jury of local men from every 100, both Norman and English, who would swear an oath on holy relics to tell the truth. The questions they posed were brutally direct, a fact we know from a rare document called the Ely Inquest, which preserves the actual interrogatory used in the eastern counties. They demanded to know the name of every manor, who held it in the time of King Edward and who holds it now. They required a precise count of the plows, the peasants, the meadows, and the woods. They asked for the value of each estate then, now, and what it could potentially yield. This was not a casual inquiry, it was a forensic audit of the entire nation. Picture the scene in a crowded hall, the murmurs of the local jurors, the scratch of the clerk's quill, and the relentless, repetitive questions cutting through the air. How many freemen lived here? How many slaves? How many mills? The commissioners had to weigh conflicting claims, settle bitter disputes over ownership, and translate local customs into a standardized format for the royal archives. The logistical challenge was staggering, all accomplished on horseback and by candlelight, without maps, filing cabinets, or any form of rapid communication. Their final triumph was to condense this mountain of raw, local testimony into the clean, Latin prose of the Domesday Book, a feat of administrative will that still defies belief, creating a permanent record from the spoken words of thousands. All of these lives, from kings to villeins, were finally pressed between two covers. The great Domesday Book itself is the ultimate key figure in our story, a physical object of immense and silent authority. Imagine holding it, a volume of over 800 large parchment folios, each page dense with compressed Latin text written in a dark, enduring ink. The scribes, perhaps only a handful of men, worked with incredible speed and uniformity, their quills scratching out a unique system of abbreviations to save precious space on the expensive vellum. Wasta becomes a simple wa, manerium is shortened to m, and hundreds of other contractions turn complex realities into a coded script. These were not mere copyists, they were editors and synthesizers on a colossal scale, making crucial decisions about what to include and what to omit from the mountains of testimony gathered by the commissioners. They standardized the chaotic local details into a clean, bureaucratic format, creating a document meant not for storytelling, but for unarguable reference. Its very survival for nearly 1,000 years is a marvel. It escaped the dissolution of the monasteries, the fire of London, and the countless wars that followed its creation, residing today in the National Archives at Kew, its pages still legible, its binding still firm. This book is more than a record. It is a monument to the will of a king and the labor of countless unknown hands, a testament to the human drive to impose order on the world, to measure, to count, and to make permanent. When you look at a digital scan of its pages, you are not just looking at a historical source, you are facing the object that made England England, a physical artifact that froze a conquered nation in time, and in doing so helped forge its future. From the king's command to the peasant's plow, these 30 lives reveal a truth often lost in the dry statistics. The Domesday Book is not a ledger of things, but a census of people. It is a human document, written in the language of property and power. Its legacy is a double-edged sword, a paradox frozen in parchment. For the people of 1186, it was an instrument of oppression, the final, unarguable word in a conquest that stripped the old elite of their lands and bound the common man to the soil. It was the legal foundation for a new foreign aristocracy, a tool used to squeeze every possible penny from a traumatized nation. Yet for us, 1,000 years removed, it is an unparalleled historical treasure, a window into a world that would otherwise be shrouded in silence. It gives names to the nameless and voices, however faint, to the vast majority who built the medieval world with their hands. This single volume connects the throne room to the peasant's hut, proving that history is not just made by kings, but by every soul counted within its pages. So as we close this great book, the mystery remains alive. Which of these 30 figures captured your imagination the most? Was it the tragic ghost of Waltheof, the resilient merchant Colsween, or the formidable Judith, who turned personal disaster into unparalleled power? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to continue your journey into the deepest mysteries of the medieval world.